Some invitations are not meant to welcome you back. They're meant to remind you how easily people can forget your pain. The Lawson family dining room glowed with soft amber light and polished silver reflections as Thanksgiving dinner unfolded behind walls of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the cold Chicago suburbs. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the house, while laughter bounced across crystal glasses and expensive plates no one actually needed. At the center of the table, Derek Lawson leaned back in his chair with the loose confidence of a man performing for an audience he thought already belonged to him. His new wife, Courtney, rested one manicured hand on his arm while his mother poured wine beside them, smiling too hard at every joke he made. "I honestly didn't think Vivien would dare show up tonight," Derek said loudly, cutting through the room with the edge of a grin that made a few relatives laugh before they even processed the cruelty in it. Someone coughed awkwardly. Someone else pretended to focus on carving turkey, but nobody told him to stop. The empty chair near the far end of the table sat untouched, almost staged, waiting like part of the entertainment. Derek lifted his glass slightly. Guess some people know when they're not wanted. More laughter followed this time, thinner and meaner, the kind people used when they wanted to stay close to power. Outside, snow drifted softly across the dark street, while warm yellow light spilled from the Lawson home into the freezing November night. Then the front door opened. The sound was small, quiet enough that half the room didn't notice at first. But Derek did. Vivien Brooks stepped inside without rushing, closing the door gently behind her as cold air swept through the marble foyer. She wore a long black wool coat dusted lightly with snowflakes that melted under the chandelier light. No diamonds, no dramatic entrance, just calm. The conversations around the table weakened one by one until the room settled into a strange silence that felt heavier than shouting. Vivien removed her gloves slowly, revealing elegant dark hands that no longer shook the way they used to during the last years of her marriage. Derek's smile stiffened for half a second before returning. "Well," he said, leaning back again, "look who finally remembered where we live." Courtney laughed immediately, too quickly, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. Vivien looked toward the table, her expression unreadable. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said softly. Derek's mother forced a smile and gestured toward the empty chair. "We saved you a seat." Vivien walked across the dining room floor with measured steps as forks paused halfway to mouths, and eyes followed her from every corner of the table. She could feel it all again without needing anyone to say it aloud. The years she spent shrinking herself to protect Derek's ego. The nights she sat alone waiting for him to come home from business dinners. The way he slowly turned her sacrifices into evidence that she was weak. Vivien reached the chair and placed one hand lightly against the backrest before sitting down. The crystal chandelier above reflected softly against her smooth, dark skin while the gold candlelight flickered across her face. She looked beautiful in the quietest possible way, and somehow that irritated Derek more than if she had arrived angry. He picked up his knife again and sliced into the turkey breast with careful precision. "I'm surprised you came alone," he said casually. Vivien folded her napkin onto her lap without looking at him right away. "So am I," she answered. And for the first time that night, Derek's smile almost disappeared. The tension around the table settled like smoke after Vivien's words, thin but impossible to ignore. Derek laughed first, though it sounded forced this time. The kind of laugh people used when they felt a room slipping away from them. "Still mysterious, huh?" he said as he carved another slice of turkey onto his plate. "That used to drive me crazy." Courtney smiled beside him, but her eyes flickered toward Vivien with quiet uncertainty now, as if she had expected tears instead of composure. Vivien reached calmly for her water glass. The ice shifted softly against crystal as she took a small sip without responding. Derek's younger brother cleared his throat and tried to restart normal conversation by asking about football, but Derek was not finished. He leaned back in his chair and drummed his fingers lightly against the table. "You know," he said, glancing around at his relatives, "Vivien always hated Thanksgiving. Too much pressure for her." His mother gave a small nervous chuckle. "Derek?" "No, seriously," he continued with a smile that carried years of old resentment underneath it. "She could never handle family dinners. Bills stressed her out. Hosting stressed her out. Honestly, everything stressed her out." A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks, but nobody interrupted him. Vivien lowered her gaze briefly toward the folded napkin resting perfectly in her lap. Her expression never changed, yet something in her stillness made Courtney sit straighter in her seat. Derek stabbed at the sweet potatoes on his plate. I used to tell her all the time that life gets easier when you stop overthinking every little thing. Vivien finally looked up at him then, calm and unreadable beneath the chandelier light. That is interesting, she said softly. Because I sleep very well now. The words landed gently, but the silence afterward cut deeper than shouting. Derek's jaw tightened almost invisibly before he forced another laugh. Well, I would hope so. You do not exactly have much responsibility these days. His aunt quickly reached for the wine bottle. Who wants another glass? Nobody answered right away. Outside the windows, snow continued drifting across the dark yard while heat from the fireplace wrapped heavily around the room. Vivien noticed how the flames reflected against the framed family photos on the walls. Most of them had been taken after the divorce. It was as if she had been carefully erased from the history of the house she once helped decorate. Derek's mother finally spoke, trying to soften the atmosphere. So, Vivien, what are you doing these days? Before Vivien could answer, Derek leaned forward immediately, probably still figuring life out. This time the laughter came slower, smaller. A cousin near the end of the table lowered his eyes toward his plate instead of joining in. Courtney smiled politely, but she looked uncomfortable now. Vivien rested one hand lightly beside her fork. Her fingers no longer trembled the way they used to during arguments with Derek years ago. She remembered those nights too clearly sometimes. Sitting at the kitchen counter while overdue notices piled beside unpaid electric bills. Listening to Derek explain why his career mattered more than her exhaustion. Watching herself disappear one apology at a time. But tonight felt different. Tonight she could feel something changing inside her with every cruel little comment he made. Not anger. Distance. Like she was finally seeing him clearly from far away instead of drowning beside him. Derek lifted his wine glass again. I mean, let us be honest, he said with a smirk. Some people are just not built for success. Vivien looked at him quietly for a long moment before offering the smallest smile. Peace feels a lot like success to me. The room fell silent again. And somewhere deep inside that silence, Derek began realizing he was no longer speaking to the woman he used to control. The clinking of silverware slowly returned around the table, but the warmth that usually came with Thanksgiving never fully recovered. Every conversation now felt careful, as if people were choosing their words with one eye on Derek and the other on Vivien. The candles burned lower at the center of the table, throwing soft shadows across polished plates and half-finished wine glasses, while snow continued gathering outside the windows in quiet layers. Derek noticed the shift before anyone else did. He could feel attention slipping away from him every time Vivien answered calmly instead of breaking apart the way he expected. That irritated him more than anger ever could. He leaned back in his chair again and forced another easy smile onto his face. You know what is funny, he said, glancing toward his uncle. Vivien always used to say she wanted a peaceful life. He shook his head dramatically. Meanwhile, I was working 80 hours a week trying to build one for us. His mother nodded sympathetically. Derek has always been ambitious. Vivien reached for the dinner roll basket and placed one onto her plate with steady hands. She remembered those 80-hour weeks differently. She remembered eating alone at midnight while invoices piled on the kitchen counter. She remembered driving through freezing rain to pick Derek up after office parties because he was too drunk to drive himself home. She remembered canceling job interviews because Derek said her career distracted her from supporting his. But none of those memories showed on her face now. That was the part Derek could not understand. Courtney brushed her blonde hair behind one ear and gave Vivien an artificial smile. Well, at least everything worked out for everyone in the end. The sentence hung awkwardly in the air. Vivien looked at her politely. Did it? Courtney blinked slightly, caught off guard by the softness of the question. Derek immediately jumped back in before the silence could deepen. Come on, Vivien. Nobody wants drama tonight. He cut another piece of turkey aggressively against the china plate. We are all adults here. Vivien almost smiled at that. Adults. She remembered standing in their old apartment laundry room, crying quietly after Derek told her she embarrassed him at a company dinner because she talked too much about books instead of investments. She remembered apologizing for things that were never wrong in the first place. The version of herself sitting at this table years ago would have tried desperately to keep everyone comfortable. Tonight, she simply sat still while the discomfort belonged to someone else. Derek's cousin finally spoke up carefully. "So, Vivien, are you still living downtown?" "Yes," Vivien answered. "Small apartment near Oak Street." Derek smirked immediately. "Tiny apartment," he corrected. "I saw the building once. Parking there is terrible." A few people chuckled automatically, but the energy behind it felt weaker now. Vivien nodded lightly. "It is quiet, though." Derek shook his head as if amused by her standards. "You always settled for less than you deserved." This time Vivien looked directly at him, her dark eyes calm beneath the candlelight. "No," she said gently. "I settled for less than I was told I deserved." The room went completely silent. Even the fireplace crackling nearby suddenly sounded louder. Derek stared at her for half a second too long before looking away toward his wine glass. His jaw tightened again. Across the table, his aunt shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Courtney focused very hard on cutting her sweet potatoes into smaller pieces. Vivien lowered her gaze back toward her plate. Then suddenly, her phone vibrated softly beside her folded napkin. The sound was small, but in the silence, everyone heard it. Derek glanced downward automatically. Vivien looked at the screen for only a moment, and for the first time all evening, something almost invisible changed in her expression. Not excitement, not surprise, relief. She picked up the phone calmly and typed a short reply before setting it back down beside her wine glass. Derek watched her carefully now. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Vivien looked up slowly. A faint smile touched her lips. "Yes," she answered softly. "He is almost here." For a moment, nobody spoke after Vivien said he was almost there. The soft jazz music playing through the ceiling speakers suddenly felt too quiet, too distant, like even the house itself was waiting for something to happen. Derek forced a smile again, but this one looked thinner than before. He repeated casually while reaching for his wine glass. "Well, this should be interesting." Courtney glanced between them with growing curiosity. Across the table, Derek's mother straightened slightly in her chair. "Vivien," she said carefully, "you did not mention you were seeing someone." Vivien adjusted the sleeve of her black dress calmly beneath the candlelight. "There are many things I do not mention anymore." Derek let out a dry laugh. "Come on. You disappear for 2 years, move into a shoebox apartment downtown, and suddenly there is a mystery man." He shook his head. "That sounds like one of those holiday movies people stream after midnight." A few relatives chuckled politely, but the energy behind it felt nervous now instead of cruel. Vivien did not respond immediately. Her fingers rested lightly against the stem of her water glass while memories drifted through her mind like reflections against dark windows. 2 years earlier, silence used to terrify her. After the divorce papers were signed, the quiet inside her tiny apartment felt unbearable at first. No television running in the background. No angry footsteps. No tension hanging in every room waiting for the next criticism to arrive. Just silence. She remembered sitting on the hardwood floor beside unopened boxes her first night there, wrapped in a gray blanket, while Chicago traffic hummed faintly beneath the windows 15 stories below. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and loneliness. There was barely enough space for a couch and a small kitchen table near the radiator. But for the first time in years, nobody was telling her who she needed to become. Mornings slowly turned into routines. Coffee brewing before sunrise. Taking the train downtown through winter snow. Shelving books at a small independent bookstore near Oak Street, while soft music played through old speakers overhead. Some days were still painful. Some nights, she cried quietly without fully understanding why. But healing arrived in ordinary moments instead of dramatic ones. In warm coffee cups. In peaceful mornings. In learning how to breathe without apologizing for taking up space. "Vivien." Derek's voice pulled her gently back into the dining room. "You still with us?" She blinked once and looked toward him again. "Yes." Derek smirked faintly. "You used to drift off like that during arguments, too." Courtney laughed under her breath before quickly stopping when nobody joined her. Vivien looked toward the fireplace instead of reacting. The flames flickered softly across framed family portraits lining the walls. None of them included her anymore. Strangely, that no longer hurt the way it once would have. Derek leaned forward against the table. "So what does this mystery guy do?" he asked. "Let me guess. Tech startup." Vivien almost smiled to herself. Derek had always believed success needed to announce itself loudly. Bigger house, louder watch, newer car, more expensive wine. He never understood the kind of power that entered quietly. He works a lot, Vivien answered simply. Sounds thrilling, Derek muttered. His cousin shifted awkwardly and tried changing the subject again. Vivien always liked quiet people. Derek laughed immediately. That is because she could never handle ambition. Vivien finally looked directly at him then, calm as winter glass. No, she said softly. I just learned the difference between ambition and ego. Derek opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the deep sound of a luxury car engine rolled softly into the driveway outside. Every head at the table turned instinctively toward the front windows. Then came the quiet crunch of footsteps crossing fresh snow toward the front door. Vivien lowered her eyes briefly and smiled to herself for the first time that night. The sound of footsteps outside seemed to slow the entire room. Nobody reached for their food anymore. Even the football game playing silently on the television above the fireplace had become background noise to the tension gathering around the table. Derek glanced toward the front door with a faint smirk still hanging on his face, but something uncertain had begun forming underneath it now. Vivien sat quietly beside the candlelight, her posture relaxed in a way that looked almost unfamiliar on her. She no longer carried herself like someone waiting to be judged. The doorbell rang once. Clear. Calm. Derek's mother stood too quickly from her chair and nearly knocked her napkin to the floor. I will get it, she said, forcing brightness into her voice as she disappeared into the foyer. The room stayed silent behind her except for the crackling fireplace and the faint hiss of snow brushing against the windows outside. Courtney leaned closer toward Derek and whispered something under her breath, but his attention remained fixed toward the hallway now. Vivien lowered her eyes briefly toward her untouched wine glass as memories surfaced quietly inside her mind. The first time she met Adrian Keller, she almost did not notice him. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late February, gray and freezing outside, the kind of Chicago cold that made people walk faster with their shoulders raised against the wind. The bookstore had been nearly empty except for soft jazz music and the smell of espresso drifting from the small cafe corner near the front window. Vivien had been reshelving hardcovers when she saw him standing alone near the history section, wearing a charcoal wool coat dusted lightly with snow. He did not carry himself like wealthy men usually did. No loud phone calls. No expensive watch flashed carelessly for attention. He simply stood there reading the back of a book as if he had nowhere more important to be. Excuse me, he asked politely after a moment. Do you still have this in hardcover? His voice was calm and low, the kind that never needed to dominate a room. Vivien glanced at the title in his hand and smiled faintly. I think we sold the last copy yesterday. Adrian nodded once without irritation. That probably means it is worth reading. She remembered laughing softly at that. It was the first genuine laugh she had heard come out of herself in months. Over time, he became familiar in small ways. A man who always arrived alone, who remembered the names of employees, who thanked people without sounding distracted while doing it. Sometimes he stayed in the cafe corner for an hour reading beside the window while snow drifted across Oak Street outside. Sometimes he asked Vivien about books she recommended and actually listened to the answers. There was never any performance in him. No need to impress. No need to win every conversation. And after years of surviving Derek's constant need for control, Adrian's quietness felt almost unreal. Back in the dining room, voices suddenly echoed faintly from the foyer. Then silence again. Derek straightened slightly in his chair. What is taking so long? He muttered. A second later, his mother reappeared slowly beside the hallway entrance. But something about her expression had changed completely. The confidence was gone now. She looked almost startled. Vivien, she said carefully, your husband is here. The room froze. Courtney's fork slipped softly against her plate. Derek blinked once as if he thought he heard wrong. Her what? Then Adrian Keller stepped into the dining room wearing a dark tailored overcoat with melting snow resting along the shoulders. Calm gray eyes moved across the room once before settling quietly on Vivien. And in that exact moment, Derek Lawson stopped breathing like a confident man. The dining room seemed smaller the moment Adrian Keller entered it. Not because he demanded attention, but because everyone gave it to him instinctively. Snow melted slowly along the shoulders of his dark overcoat, while warm candlelight reflected against the silver watch resting quietly beneath his cuff. Nothing about him looked loud. Nothing looked desperate to impress. Yet the entire room shifted around his presence as if power itself had just stepped through the front door, wearing polished black shoes. Vivien rose slowly from her chair. For the first time all evening, softness appeared fully in her expression. Adrien walked toward her with calm, measured steps before leaning down just enough to kiss her gently on the cheek. "Sorry I am late," he said quietly. "Traffic leaving downtown was difficult." Vivien smiled faintly. "You made it." Derek stared at them without blinking. Courtney looked between Adrien and Vivien with growing confusion, while Derek's mother rushed forward suddenly. Her entire tone transformed. "Mr. Keller," she said with visible surprise. "We did not realize." Adrien offered her a polite handshake before removing his gloves. "Please," he answered calmly. "Adrien is fine." Derek still had not moved from his chair. His face had lost all color now. Vivien noticed it immediately. She knew that expression. Derek only looked uncertain when something existed outside his control. Adrien finally turned toward the table. "Good evening," he said politely to the room. His voice remained calm, effortless, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it in order to be heard. Courtney leaned closer toward Derek and whispered sharply, "You know him?" Derek swallowed once before answering under his breath. "Everybody in finance knows him." Vivien heard it anyway. Across the dining room, Derek's uncle suddenly stood to shake Adrien's hand while introducing himself far too enthusiastically. Someone else quickly offered him wine. Derek's mother hurried to clear space at the table as if royalty had arrived unexpectedly. Vivien watched the transformation silently. 30 minutes earlier, these same people had laughed while Derek mocked her tiny apartment and quiet life. Now every smile looked nervous. Every movement looked rehearsed. Adrien noticed the empty chair beside Vivien immediately. "May I?" he asked her softly. Vivien nodded. He removed his coat carefully before sitting beside her with the same calm composure he carried everywhere else. Derek finally forced a smile onto his face. "Small world," he said, though his voice sounded tighter now. "I had no idea you and Vivien knew each other." Adrien looked toward him calmly. "We have been married for 8 months. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Courtney's fork slipped softly from her hand onto the plate. Derek blinked hard once, like his mind needed time to catch up with the sentence. "Married?" he repeated quietly. Vivien folded her hands together near her plate. "We wanted something private." Derek stared at her. "You got married and nobody knew?" Adrien answered before Vivien could. "Some things matter more when they are protected instead of displayed." The sentence landed gently, but Derek visibly stiffened. Because everything Derek valued had always required an audience. Bigger promotions, bigger parties, louder recognition. Across the table, his cousin suddenly cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, Adrien Keller, as in Keller Capital." Adrien nodded once. "Yes." Another silence spread immediately, this one heavier than the last. Derek looked down toward his wine glass as realization slowly settled across his face. Vivien watched him carefully now. He knew exactly who Adrien was. Everyone in Chicago's business world did. Keller Capital owned half the skyline downtown and invested in companies powerful enough to shape careers overnight. Derek worked for one of them. Adrien rested one hand calmly near Vivien's chair and glanced toward her with quiet warmth. "Have you eaten?" he asked softly. Not once had he tried to dominate the room. Not once had he mentioned money. Yet somehow Derek Lawson had never looked smaller in his own house. The atmosphere around the table transformed completely after Adrien spoke. The same relatives who had barely looked at Vivien earlier were suddenly leaning forward with careful smiles and polished manners, asking questions they thought sounded intelligent enough for a billionaire to answer. Derek sat frozen at the head of the table while candlelight flickered against the tightness in his face. His wine glass remained untouched now. Across from him, Courtney straightened her posture and smoothed her dress nervously every few seconds, as if she suddenly realized she had arrived at the wrong level of conversation. Adrien accepted a glass of wine with a polite nod, but barely touched it. His attention stayed mostly on Vivien. "Did you eat anything yet?" he asked quietly again. Vivien smiled faintly. "Not really." Without hesitation, Adrien reached for the serving plate nearest him and calmly placed turkey, roasted vegetables, and sweet potatoes onto her plate before serving himself. It was a small gesture, ordinary even, but Vivien noticed the entire table watching it in silence. Derek especially, because during all their years of marriage, Derek had never once noticed whether she had eaten. "So," Derek finally said, forcing confidence back into his voice, "how did the two of you meet?" Adrian glanced toward Vivien first before answering. "A bookstore." Derek blinked once. "A bookstore? She recommended a book I ended up reading twice," Adrian replied calmly. "That usually means the person recommending it is worth listening to." Vivien lowered her eyes briefly, hiding a small smile behind her wine glass. Around the table, several relatives laughed softly, but this time the warmth in the room no longer belonged to Derek. He could feel it. Everyone could. Derek leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Well, Vivien always liked quiet little places." Adrian looked at him politely. "There is value in quiet places." The sentence sounded simple, but Derek shifted slightly afterward as though something inside him recognized the difference between confidence and performance. His uncle suddenly leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Keller, I read Keller Capital is expanding into commercial acquisitions next year." Adrian nodded once. "We are reviewing a few companies now." Derek's fingers tightened subtly around the stem of his glass. Vivien noticed it immediately. Adrian continued calmly. "Mostly firms struggling with leadership instability." Derek looked down for half a second too long. Courtney glanced toward him with confusion. "Derek, is that not what your company has been dealing with lately?" The silence that followed landed harder than any insult could have. Derek forced a quick laugh. "Every company has challenges." Adrian nodded politely. "That is true." But he did not elaborate further. He did not need to. The weight of what remained unsaid settled naturally across the room. Vivien sat quietly beside him, almost overwhelmed by the contrast between this man and the one she used to beg for kindness from. Adrian never tried to make people feel small, yet somehow the truth about everyone became visible around him anyway. Derek suddenly pushed his plate slightly away. "Funny world," he muttered. "Vivien always said she wanted a simple life. Did not think she would end up marrying one of the richest men in Chicago." Vivien looked toward him calmly. "I did not marry him because he was rich." Derek smirked faintly. "Sure." Adrian finally turned toward Derek fully then, his expression still composed. "She married me because I listened when she spoke." The room fell completely silent again. No one moved. Even the fireplace seemed quieter now. Vivien felt something tighten gently in her chest, hearing those words spoken so simply. Because after years of being interrupted, dismissed, corrected, and minimized, being listened to had once felt impossible. Derek looked away first. Courtney stared down at her plate. And across the dining room table covered in crystal glasses and expensive china, Vivien realized something almost surreal. She was no longer the smallest person in the room. Derek was. The rest of dinner moved differently after that. Conversations no longer revolved around Derek's stories or his expensive renovations or the promotion he had bragged about earlier that evening. Every question drifted naturally toward Adrian now, though he answered each one with quiet restraint that somehow made people lean closer instead of losing interest. Derek's relatives laughed too eagerly at his polite comments. His mother refilled Adrian's wine glass before it was even half empty. Courtney kept adjusting her smile every time Adrian spoke, as if trying to calculate how important this dinner had suddenly become. Vivien sat quietly beside him, watching the entire room transform in real time. It was astonishing how quickly people changed once Status entered the room, wearing a tailored coat and calm confidence. Earlier that evening, nobody defended her while Derek mocked her apartment, her peace, her life after divorce. Now those same people looked at her like they had misjudged something valuable. Adrian rested one hand lightly near hers beneath the table, not possessive, not performative, just present. The simple warmth of it grounded her more than she expected. Derek noticed the gesture immediately. His jaw tightened again. "So," he said suddenly, forcing a casual tone, "what exactly does Keller Capital see in companies these days?" Adrian looked toward him calmly. "Strong leadership. Stability. Integrity." Derek nodded too quickly. "Right." Adrian reached for his glass. "Most businesses fail because people underestimate character." The room grew quieter again. Vivien could almost feel Derek searching desperately for control somewhere inside the conversation. "Well," Derek said with a dry laugh. Business is not exactly built on emotions. Adrian glanced toward him. No, but reputations are. That landed harder than anything else at all night. Derek looked down immediately, pretending to adjust his napkin while tension settled visibly across his shoulders. Courtney shifted uncomfortably beside him. Across the table, Derek's uncle cleared his throat carefully. I heard Keller Capital might acquire Harrington Financial. Derek froze. Vivien noticed it before anyone else. Just a slight pause. A small tightening around his eyes. Adrian answered simply. We are in final discussions. The color slowly drained from Derek's face again. Harrington Financial was Derek's company. The company he spent years sacrificing everything for. The company he constantly used to measure his own importance. Courtney looked toward him in confusion. Wait, she said quietly. Is that where you work? Derek forced another laugh, but this one sounded brittle now. Acquisitions happen all the time. Adrian nodded politely. They do. Then silence. Heavy and suffocating. Nobody at the table missed what was happening anymore. Derek had spent the entire evening trying to remind Vivien how small her life had become after him. But now every person in that room understood the truth at the same time. The woman he humiliated was sitting beside the man powerful enough to decide the future of his career. And somehow neither Vivien nor Adrian seemed interested in using that power against him. That was the part Derek could not survive emotionally. If Adrian had mocked him back, he could have called it arrogance. If Vivien had humiliated him publicly, he could have called her bitter. But neither of them did. Adrian simply cut another piece of turkey calmly, while Vivien sat beside him with quiet grace that no longer asked anyone for approval. Derek suddenly pushed his chair back slightly. Excuse me, he muttered before standing too quickly from the table. His wine glass tipped sideways, spilling dark red across the white tablecloth like a stain nobody could ignore. Courtney stood halfway, embarrassed. Derek grabbed a napkin aggressively and tried wiping it himself. I got it, he snapped when his mother moved toward him. The entire room watched him unravel in small, humiliating pieces, while Adrian remained perfectly calm beside Vivien. Then Adrian leaned slightly toward her and asked softly, Are you ready to go home? Vivien looked at him for a moment beneath the warm candlelight and realized something extraordinary. For the first time in years, the word home no longer sounded painful. The dining room remained silent after Adrian asked if she was ready to go home. Not one person at the table tried speaking first. The only sound came from the fireplace and the faint tapping of snow against the tall windows overlooking the dark street outside. Vivien looked slowly around the room that once made her feel invisible. The same chandelier still hung above the table. The same. Polished silverware reflected warm amber light across expensive plates and half-empty wine glasses. Years ago, she used to sit in this house trying desperately to earn kindness from people who had already decided her value depended on Derek's approval. Tonight, for the first time, she saw everything clearly. Nobody here had truly changed. Only the balance of power had. Adrian waited beside her patiently without rushing her answer. That patience touched her more deeply than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Derek stood near the end of the table holding a wine-stained napkin in one hand, while his carefully constructed confidence collapsed piece by piece beneath the weight of his own humiliation. Courtney avoided looking directly at anyone now. Derek's mother folded and unfolded her hands nervously beside her plate. Vivien rose slowly from her chair. Adrian stood immediately beside her, not because she needed help, but because respect had become instinctive to him. The movement alone changed the atmosphere again. Derek looked up at her quickly. Vivien, he said, his voice rougher now, stripped of the smooth arrogance he carried earlier. She turned toward him calmly. For a moment, nobody else in the room seemed to breathe. Derek opened his mouth slightly, as if searching for the version of her he used to control. The woman who apologized too quickly. The woman who stayed quiet because she feared being abandoned. But she was gone now. I did not know, he finally muttered. Vivien held his gaze without anger. You never asked. The sentence settled softly into the room, but nobody could escape it. Not Derek. Not his family. Not even Vivien herself. Because it was true in more ways than one. Derek never asked what made her happy. Never asked why she cried quietly at night. Never asked what parts of herself she sacrificed trying to keep their marriage alive. He only noticed her absence once someone else recognized her worth completely. Adrian stepped forward and picked up Vivien's black wool coat from the chair behind her. His movements stayed calm, effortless, untouched by the tension around them. He gently held the coat open while she slipped her arms into it. Such a simple gesture, yet it carried more tenderness than years of her marriage ever had. Derek watched the moment in silence. And somehow that silence humiliated him more than revenge ever could have. Vivien adjusted the collar lightly before reaching for her gloves beside the plate she barely touched all evening. Around the table, relatives suddenly avoided eye contact with her, ashamed of how quickly they had laughed earlier. Nobody knew what to say anymore because the truth had already spoken for itself. Adrian rested one hand softly against Vivien's back as they walked toward the foyer together. Derek's voice stopped them just before the front door. "Vivien." She paused. Snow drifted quietly beyond the glass windows while cold blue light stretched across the marble floor. Derek swallowed hard before speaking again. "You really happy?" Vivien looked at him one last time. Not with pride. Not with bitterness.